Is the book really always better? Let's find out. Welcome to hashtag The Book Is Better, The Green Mile.
Page versus film, book versus movie. Written word strikes hard, but surround sounds groovy. It's a many decades old debate. Do only words truly satiate? Or is the movie really just as great? What's the best way to create? Page versus film.
Stephen King is known throughout much of the world as the king of horror. At the time of this script, he has been writing for 50 years and has published 65 novels, 5 non-fiction books, and over 200 short stories. He retired briefly in 2002 and later said he would retire once he had completed the Dark Tower series. Neither of those stuck, and he published both a novel in 2023 called Holly and a collection of short stories this year, 2024, called You Like It Darker. Full disclosure, I have read neither of these, and am in fact slightly irritated at him stealing titles from Leonard Cohen. In 1996, King had an unusually prolific year, publishing 3 books in a short span. 2 of them, Desperation and The Regulators, were mirror novels designed to be read back-to-back. The third, however, The Green Mile, was very different from most of King's other works. While The Green Mile could, perhaps, be considered a member of the horror genre, it lacks the traditional tropes of monsters, ghosts, or serial killers. While The Green Mile is certainly an unsettling background, it isn't spooky in the traditional way that the house in Salem's Lot or the cemetery in Pet Sematary are. It's just not a pleasant place to work. The serial killer is locked up, the supernatural being is afraid of the dark, and instead of ghosts, we have a mouse. While Stephen King makes it apparent that working on Block E is hard on the spirit, I would argue that The Green Mile is no more a horror book than, say, Dead Man Walking. There are some supernatural elements, some drama, some horrific moments, and especially in the movie, some comedy. The book has been defined as dark fantasy, southern gothic, magic realism, thriller, crime drama, supernatural. You get the point. It's hard to put The Green Mile in a box.
Nobody puts baby in a corner.
Published originally as a 6-edition serial novel, The Green Mile was a very expensive book for its time, since readers had to buy all 6 books at about $4 each. Even by today's standards, $24 for a fairly short paperback is a bit much. My trusty inflation calculator says that would be about $48 now, but you can buy the compilation paperback at your local bookstore for $19.99 today. Each section was around 90 pages. But since the compilation novel excludes all the extra author's intro and author's comments, the book only totals about 344 pages, or at least my copy does. Additionally, the serial novel was released over 5 months. Because of this, each book includes a lot of previously on segments. These are still in the compilation novel, and let me tell you, if you are reading all 6 books back-to-back in a short period of time, they get tiresome quickly. I would also guess they knock the actual story down to maybe 300 pages. The Green Mile was initially imagined as being narrated by a prison trustee who sells sandwiches and snacks from a little cart and has a pet mouse. For those of you familiar with the book, yes, the original main character of The Green Mile was Toot Toot. John Coffey's name was initially Luke, and he was a guy who liked sleight-of-hand tricks. The transformation of this idea into what we got must have been quite the rabbit hole. It was certainly a journey for the better. There was no bad casting in The Green Mile, and the casting director for this movie should absolutely be commended for an amazing job. Michael Clarke Duncan was, of course, incredible, and Doug Hutchinson is seriously underappreciated in his role as the despicable Percy Wetmore. A few choices were more interesting than others, though. I won't be covering every single role in the movie, because I don't want this video to be an hour. But I do think some deserve a little discussion for having caused a bit of an eyebrow raised in one way or another. Tom Hanks is great as younger Paul Edgecombe. Not only does he remain one of the few actors who can do more subtle facial acting, Paul Edgecombe's urinary tract infection plays an enormous role in the story, and no one can piss on camera like Tom Hanks. Hanks is partnered with David Morse, who plays Brutal Howard. Unfortunately, while in the book dialogue is determined by character, in movies it is often determined by star power, and many of the lines given to Brutal in the book were given to Paul Edgecombe in the movie. So while Brutal is supposed to be a funny nickname for a large man who is slow to anger, instead he becomes a more two-dimensional angry guy.
Where do you come from? You put your arms up?
The casting of Dean was beautifully done, but Jeffrey DeMunn was chosen for Harry. I've always found this fascinating since Harry is supposed to have been 10 years younger than Paul in the book. Perhaps the goal was to keep us from thinking too much about Paul's age, for the twist to come, but DeMunn's acting is wonderful, and again, it changes very little about the actual story. Finally, Sam Rockwell as Wild Bill does a sensational job at playing crazy, but the fact that he was 56 when he played the role, and Wild Bill is supposed to be 19, does make an enormous difference to the story. Paul is told when he first gets the report he's working appeals, and there's the fact that he's a minor. The suggestion is that he may never make it to Old Sparky. Movie and book are very similar in many ways. In fact, reading the book and watching the movie close together, one can pick out individual lines that were taken verbatim. The timeline is tightened up for the movie, and they even cut the assistant warden from the movie completely. But this has little effect on the overall tone of the story. For those of you who watched my Hunger Games video, you will hopefully remember this falls under rule number 2 in my comparisons. Movies are a visual medium, and I understand that reasonable cuts will always have to be made when adapting from a written source. If you haven't seen the Hunger Games video, you can find a full list of my house rules at the link in the description. No, what changes the atmosphere are little details. The way a line is spoken, the tiny differences in character traits. These compile as the movie goes. So let's take a quick look at the plot of the book and the movie, and why these tiny changes made far more of a difference than removing entire characters. Book and movie both begin with our protagonist, Paul Edgecombe, as an elderly man living in a nursing home. He has his special friend, Ellie. In the book, Ellie is the grandmother of a state senator. In the movie, it is never mentioned. In the book, Paul writes basically a diary and gives it to Ellie to read. In the movie, he tells it to her directly. Since the movie is told verbally from one person to another, it is presented in a more linear fashion, which I appreciate. There are only 2 major differences in the introduction. In the book, Paul has developed a bully at his nursing home. An orderly named Brad who grabs him, bruises his wrists, tears his papers, frightens him, and is generally a terrible person. Ellie's connections eventually provide Paul with protection. In the movie, Brad doesn't exist, so bringing up Ellie's connections doesn't matter. Cutting Brad is honestly fine. He doesn't even show up until the second novelette, and appears to be there mainly as a motivator to keep Paul writing. He often feels like a way to pad the book's, runtime, read time, word count, whatever it is. He isn't missed at all when he's gone. Strangely, the point is made several times that Brad always carries around something to read, as if this is a bad thing. A bizarre perspective coming from a writer. The other major difference matters slightly more. The book takes place in 1932, the movie in 1935. This was done in order to add the famous cheek-to-cheek dance scene to the movie. The problem is 1932 was smack dab in the middle of the worst parts of the Great Depression for many parts of the country. The fear of unemployment plays a large role in the story, and unemployment nationwide at that time was 23.6%. It would get higher the following year, but by 1935, the country would have begun its slow recovery. Government food and work programs were in place, and unemployment had dropped some. So while the threats of unemployment was still severe, probably not as much a threat in 1935 as in 1932. I'm not sure Stephen King made this choice on purpose, though. He says in his opening, "I thought the research might kill the fragile sense of wonder I found in my story," quote unquote. He admitted that many of the details he'd gotten right about the era were mainly due to luck. It irritates me to give credit for fluke. You'd think a man worth $500 million could hire a research assistant. In the movie's favor, introducing cheek-to-cheek adds a tremendous amount of emotion to both the introduction and towards the end of the movie. I said in the Hunger Games that adding extra scenes to a movie is rarely needed, but this is one case where I think there's an exception. This is a scene that everyone remembers as much or perhaps even more than the climax of the movie. Many people are moved to tears by the ending, but the build-up to that scene is done here, and without a doubt, the impact of John Coffey's end would not have been as great without it. The proper story begins, and we go back in time to the 1930s. Paul Edgecombe is a prison guard on Block E, the last resting place of those convicted to death and known in the area as the Green Mile due to the color of its floors. His best friend and co-workers are Brutus, or Brutal Howard, Dean Stanton, and Harry Terwilliger. There are 2 prisoners on death row to begin, the Cajun Frenchman Edward Delacroix and Arlen the Chief Bitterbuck. In the book, the inmates' crimes are an important part of the story, and one of the things we learn is that it's possible to care about someone who has done something heinous. In the movie, we are never told their crimes. Instead, the story jumps directly to John Coffey. Here is the first major tone shift of the movie: the absence of the prez. In the source material, there's an underlying, not-so-subtle message around the racial differences on death row. This begins immediately with the introductions of Bitterbuck and the prez, who are both present and gone before any of the other inmates ever enter the scene. The prez is a middle-aged, white-collar white man. He threw his senile father out a window for the insurance money. The chief is a Native American man who got into a drunken brawl with another drunken man over a pair of boots and accidentally killed him. Arlen Bitterbuck is put to death. The president is commuted to life in prison. Despite having committed the far more heinous crime, Paul Edgecombe says he knows right from the beginning, we knew just by the way he looked he wasn't made for old Sparky. And we were right. Less than a week after Percy's second run at the mouse, the prez's sentence was commuted to life, and he joined the general population. This isn't the only sentencing discrepancy mentioned early on in the book. The Green Mile has only 1 female visitor during Paul's time as warden, a woman named Beverly, who kills her husband with a straight razor for cheating on her. She, too, has her sentence commuted to a life sentence, and is later released from prison completely. Removing Beverly really makes no difference since the gender gap on death row is never mentioned again. Removing the president from the plot, though, is the beginning of a series of small changes that dilute the entire racial sub-story to the plot. Other than this, however, the movement of the timeline changes very little. Mr. Jingles isn't introduced as early, which takes away a little of his mystery. But again, it isn't a major issue to the overall arc and gives more focus on the main mythical man, John Coffey. John Coffey is a huge black man, covered in scars, and suffering from memory and cognitive issues. He is afraid of the dark and is soft-spoken, and he is accused of assaulting and killing 2 small girls. White girls. His entrance is followed quickly by that of Wild Bill, the crazy, violent psychopath who is on death row for killing 4 people, including a pregnant woman, during a robbery. Again, in the book, he is considered a minor, which makes many of his actions and those of the staff make a little more sense. His initial attack on the staff is far more believable from a teenager than a man in his 50s. Behind the scenes of both introductions is Paul Edgecombe's severe UTI. It nearly interferes with both intakes, and during Wild Bill's attack, this is what puts Paul out of the fight. Once the floor is cleared, John Coffey calls for Paul to come to his cell, and it is here we discover John Coffey has healing powers. Here again, there are some slight differences. In the book, Paul goes into Coffey's cell, something no correctional officer would ever do when on the block on their own. Even going into a cell on your own with other officers present would be considered a bad idea. In the movie, he simply steps too close, an accident that a feverish sick officer could easily make. In both cases, John Coffey grabs him, places his hand on Paul's crotch, and draws the illness from him, spitting it out in a swarm of black insect-like creatures that dissipate in the air. Here again, the movie adds a scene that is not in the books. We see Tom Hanks not only practice his peeing on camera fetish, but then go home to bang his wife all night long. She then makes John Coffey some cornbread as a thank you for her renewed sex life. This is one of those extra scenes I talk about that didn't need to happen. Who goes to work and tells the retarded violent inmate about their sex life, or gives him a connection to their family? This was a scene added for nothing but cheap laughs and ego. What is the purpose of Paul Edgecombe's healing hand job? Well, there's been another story lingering in the background as well. Paul's boss and best friend, Hal Moore, has a wife dying of a brain tumor. In the book, there is also a greater complication in that Paul is slightly in love with Hal's wife, as well as the couple being his friends. In either case, Paul becomes increasingly uncertain about Coffey's guilt in the death of the 2 girls, and decides that his healing skills are needed for Hal's wife. Together with the rest of the staff, they decide to break Coffey out of jail for a night. The barriers to this mission are Wild Bill and the despicable Percy Whitmore. Percy is a snotty young man who is related to the governor, and on a power trip in his role as a correctional officer. He makes no secret that his goal there is to participate in an execution, the task the rest of the staff find the worst part of their jobs. He takes glee in abusing inmates, pushes his weight around with other staff, and generally makes everyone's life miserable. He refuses to take responsibility for his actions despite repeated missteps, but would absolutely rat out the rest of the staff if he found out about the plans to move Coffee. He has an even more antagonistic relationship with one of the inmates, Edward Delacroix. Percy breaks his fingers, calls him names, and attempts to kill his pet. When Percy is assigned to Delacroix's execution, he promises to leave the prison once it's done. Delacroix makes the mistake of laughing at him when he's attacked by Wild Bill, though, and Percy takes revenge by sabotaging the execution and burning Delacroix to death. In the meantime, Wild Bill is wreaking havoc throughout the block, pissing on officers, destroying his bedding, and constantly forcing the officers to put him in solitary confinement. Eventually, Paul Edgecombe comes to the realization it was actually Wild Bill that killed the girls Coffee is accused of murdering. This is another major change, and possibly the one that makes the biggest impact. In the movie, Coffee is grabbed by Bill as they are smuggling him out and has a vision of the murder. In the source material, Paul figures it out with detective work, tracking Bill's movement backwards until he finds where Wild Bill stayed with the family and that he has a previous history of assaulting young girls. This matters because in the end, John Coffey is executed anyway. In the movie, there is no proof of his innocence. This gives the ending no ethical dilemma, and far too clean a closure for the cast, in my opinion. The original story has actual proof of Will being at the crime, and makes it clear that if Coffey had been white, he likely would have gotten another trial. Instead, because he's black, and because the protagonists are afraid for their careers, he is put to death. This, as a side note, is also where Brutal gets robbed of his greatest line.
On the day of my judgment, when I stand before God, and he asks me, why did I kill one of his true miracles? What am I going to say? That it was my job.
This is why, in the end, Paul tells Ellie he is cursed for executing one of God's miracles. In the movie, this line makes little sense. In the book, he did in fact choose to kill a man he might have saved. The end in general is where the movie kind of falls apart. While it's difficult to see past the amazing final scene of John Coffey's death, under examination, many of his actions just don't make sense. He drives Percy insane as punishment for Edward Delacroix's torture and death. This remains true in both sources and makes sense, because this is a crime that would not, in any other way, have been brought to justice. But he also kills Wild Bill for the murder of the girls. In the book, this is because Wild Bill is a teenager, and very likely won't ever actually see old Sparky. He might even be freed to kill again, or at least cause more mayhem. But in the movie, there's no way Bill doesn't get executed. Without youth behind him, and considering his crimes, and without the commentary about whites rarely going to the chair, there's just no justifiable reason for John Coffey to have killed him that doesn't also make Coffey a bit of a villain. The movie, like the book, ends with a discussion about all the people Paul Edgecombe leaves behind while he goes on living. His wife, his co-workers, the friends he risked his career for, and finally Ellie all pass on while he watches. Like with the inmates, we get more details in the book about their passing, all of which give the characters extra layers the movie lacks. However, the final summary also leads to Paul seeing John Coffey again in a scene that feels tacked on and unnecessary. Mr. Jingles dies at the end of the book, suggesting that with an equally stretched lifespan, Paul Edgecombe can expect to live about 600 years. However, in the movie, Mr. Jingles continues to live on, making it likely that Edgecombe lives for over 1,000 years at least. Deciding whether the book is indeed better than the movie has been a struggle. It's a large part of why this video has taken so long to make. I've gone back and forth, first using the same scale as I did for Hunger Games, and then trying to figure out how to balance the areas I consider to be worth more than a single point on a chart. I've changed the ending to this video more times than I can count at this point, and I can't promise it won't change again before I reach the end of this segment. The movie is excellent, there's no question about it. It is smoother to follow, and it cuts many extraneous ramblings and repetitions that only bog the book down. The script is simply better written. On the other hand, the book was under publishing constraints the movie was not. The 6 volumes in 5 months format was a requirement of the publisher, and much of the repetition and choppiness is a result of that formatting. The book should have been updated when it was published into a single novel, but it's impossible to know what the situation was around that. The only thing to know for sure is King has stated his desire to update it, so at least he recognizes the problems. The adaptation is also one of the best out there, with a few exceptions. there are some very strange changes that were made for no reason I can figure out, such as changing Hammersmith from a reporter in the book to Coffey's lawyer in the movie. His role and lines are almost identical, with the exception that Paul's inner dialogue in the book takes note of Hammersmith's casual, arrogant racism. This is not included in the movie in any way, which brings us to the big exception on fidelity to the source material, the racism. No matter what you may think about the depiction of racism in The Green Mile, whether it would be considered woke by modern standards or not, it is in the source material. It is in fact a huge driving factor to the source material, the major reason many of the events unfold as they do, and why Coffey's end happens as it does. Removing it from the movie completely, especially in favor of Tom Hanks getting busy with his wife, hamstrings the story. While I disagree with Stephen King on many things, and I have no desire to make this a political video, in this case, his depiction was accurate for the time, and the movie chose to water it down. I can't in good faith look at this as a good adaptation then, no matter how close the rest of the movie is when they've removed the major message of the book. I argue for the retention of lore as important to movies in other cases. If I am to stay true to that rule, that needs to mean all lore. Anything else is hypocrisy. Is that one aspect enough to make this a bad adaptation, though? That's a different question, and I'm still undecided on it. The only thing I can say for sure is that it is a shallow adaptation. The movie evokes emotions easier than the book, but they are also easier, simpler emotions. Casting was, as I have already said, amazing. I'm disappointed we lost some of the deep layers to these excellent characters, but I see no way they could have been included without making the timeline needlessly confusing. I'm disappointed in the portrayal of Jan, though. Paul's wife, she plays a fairly passive role in the movie, while she's much more involved in the book. Especially towards the end of the story, her role is imperative to making it work. Some characters were cut completely in the script, and they were excellent choices. All were characters that did little in the book but pad word and page counts, and their absence probably made the movie better. As always with this adaptation, though, there is a but. Tom Hanks is perfect. And I don't mean perfect for the role. I mean his depiction of Paul Edgecombe is a guy who is perfect. The whole point of Paul in the books is that he's morally complex. Like the very inmates he oversees, Paul is someone we like while still being horrified by some of his actions. Brutal though he has his own flaws, is supposed to be the conscience of the group, but those lines have all been given to Tom Hanks. This means Paul has no tough moral choices to make, and no real weight on his soul at the end of it all. As I mentioned, Stephen King has said he did little research on the time period for this book. While I hate to give a point for being lucky, the fact remains that his portrayal, by whatever means, was quite accurate in many ways the movie did not improve on. There are a number of little touches that make the scenes and the overall tone feel realistic for the time. It would take too long to list them all. However, whether intentioned or not, researched or not, King deserves credit for his accuracy. That being said, visually, there isn't much that's terribly spectacular in the movie. It's pretty basic, spiced up with occasionally exploding lights that, in my opinion, are kind of overdone and actually detract from the acting. The movie quality isn't reduced really, but it isn't improved either. Show me the money. It is nearly impossible for a book to win in this category due to the nature of books and film. The movie cost about $60 million to make, doubling it for advertising expenses to $120 million, but it pulled in over $286 million. Assuming a profit of about $160 million plus, at the time of its release, the movie was a major commercial success. The book tried hard, though. There aren't good numbers to show how much it made, but with its unusual release structure, the book cost most people about $24 for the full initial story. At $4 each, and about 20 million copies sold, the 6-book run probably made about $80 million just on the initial run. Add in the hundreds of thousands of books sold once it was compiled into a single book run, at $20 each. It's hard to know, but this may be the only book I ever cover to make as much money as the movie. The ratings, though, this one is tough. I won't bore you with the math that most people did not enjoy last time, but it's enough to say that both book and movie have similar ratings, and similar numbers of ratings. I looked at Amazon, Metacritic, and Rotten Tomatoes for the movie, and Amazon, Goodreads, and Google Books for the source material. All hovered around the same ratings, about 90% approval by audiences. The reread/rewatchability, as always, this is the most subjective category, and it's the one that's almost impossible for the movie to win. I figure my love of the written word and books balances out the fact that the box office is is almost always going to earn a point in these battles. However, like the box office category, this one was a surprise. I honestly struggled to get through the books again. It wasn't meant to be read straight through, and trying to do so made it painfully obvious how much repetition and needless meandering fills up the pages. I never noticed it when reading them a month or more apart. I do need to add that the book is hard in some places because it's more emotional than the movie, and I had to set the book down and walk away. This, in my mind, is actually the sign of a great book. An easy read is not always the best read. Read slower, the book is definitely better, but after cram reading the whole series in a couple of days, I was ready for it to be over. The movie, though, moved me as much as the first time I ever saw it. Time flew while I sat through it. I teared up a bit at the end, just like I did the first time, and when I rewatched the end the next day for some points on the script, I teared up again. It never seems to lose its impact. But it also didn't stick with me for days after the way a truly impactful movie does. Once I watched it, it was done. My mother read the book and said she couldn't watch the movie because the book was so intense for her. I assure you, she could have gotten through the movie with no problem at all. So where does that leave us? On the surface, this contest went to the movie easily. I even wrote the initial script that way. But as the months dragged on and I couldn't seem to finish it to my satisfaction, I rewatched, reread, rewrote, and began to realize how much was really missing from the movie. The book is deeper, the movie smoother. The book is choppy in places. The movie has issues that, if put under the kind of microscope today's movies usually suffer, should leave the viewer with some questions. If one could combine them, one might have the perfect story, a blend of emotional intensity, humor, deep characters, and bittersweet endings that leave you thinking about it for days. So, as much as it pains me, and it feels like a bit of a cop-out really, The Green Mile ends anticlimactically in a draw. I know, after months of agonizing about this, I'm upset too. Feel free to express your outrage in the comments. And on that note, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. I promise to pick something easier for the next #TheBookIsBetter, but until then, stay tuned for the second half of my underappreciated 90s sci-fi edition. You can also find me here on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Slice and Dice, my live stream about pizza and underappreciated tabletop games. On the first Monday of every month at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I interview self-published authors for indie author interviews. And, coming soon, the second and fourth Monday, we will have Shows You've Never Seen, where people who were unfortunate enough to miss the years of truly great television get introduced to some of the best shows no one ever saw. Hope to see you soon, and happy headbutting.